Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to kick off our presentation today on Mega Goal 3.2. Today, we'll be exploring the theme, they said, we said, focusing on form, meaning, and function. This is part of Unit 10, and I promise it will be an engaging look at how we communicate and understand language in different contexts. Over the next few slides, we'll cover key concepts and practical examples that will help us improve our language skills. So let's get started. Let's take a closer look at this picture. As you observe, think about the different parts of the body that are visible here. I'll also refer to the list of words on the slide, which will help us identify the specific body parts. This activity is a great way to connect what we see with the vocabulary we're learning. By doing this, we can improve our understanding of body parts and their names. So, as I describe what I see, I encourage you to do the same. Point out or think about which parts you recognize. This exercise links directly to our overall theme of learning about the human body in a fun and interactive way. Let's take a look at the V-base form and how it's used with modals. When we use modal verbs, they are always followed by the simple form of a verb, which is called the base form. For example, in a question you might say, I have a problem. Should I call my parents? Here, should is the modal, and call is the base form of the verb. In negative sentences, we can say, children shouldn't watch violent TV shows, where shouldn't is the contraction of should not. And again, it's followed by the base form watch. For affirmative sentences, we might say, you should study harder, which means it's a good idea to put more effort into studying. Remember, modal verbs like should, ought to, and had better are used to express advice or recommendations. Should is the most common way to give advice, making it very useful in everyday situations. For example, if you want to suggest a better action, you could say, you should see a doctor. So, to sum up, modal verbs help us express necessity, advice, or obligation, and they always connect to the base form of the verb. Let's take a closer look at how we use ought to and had better in different situations. First, notice that both of these expressions are followed by the base form of the verb, which is the simplest form without any endings. Now, when we use had better or ought to in a negative way, we're giving advice not to do something. For example, you had better not slow down means it's better for you to avoid slowing down. The same goes for you ought not to go outside. It suggests that staying inside is a better choice because it's very cold. On the other hand, if the advice is positive, we say, you had better slow down, or you ought to wear a warm jacket. These are recommendations for what you should do, especially in situations like driving too fast or cold weather outside. It's also worth noting that ought to and had better are not commonly used in question forms. So, they're mainly used for giving advice or making suggestions in statements. To sum up, remember that both ought to and had better are followed by the base form of the verb and are mostly used for advice, either positive or negative. That way, you can clearly express what is recommended or not recommended in different situations. Let's take a closer look at the answers on this slide. First, you'll notice the repeated use of ought to or should. These terms are often used interchangeably to give advice or recommendations, but understanding their nuances can help us communicate more effectively. When I say ought to or should, I'm suggesting what is the best course of action. They're both quite similar in meaning, but sometimes should is a bit more direct and common in everyday conversation, while ought to can sound a little more formal or traditional. Moving on, you'll see the phrase shouldn't. This is the negative form, used to advise against something or to warn that a certain action isn't recommended. It's important to recognize these distinctions because giving clear, polite advice is essential in professional and personal interactions. Now, looking at the sequence of answers, we see options labeled C, F, B, E, and D. These correspond to different choices or categories within our overall framework. Remember, the key here is to match the advice or recommendation with the appropriate context, whether it's positive guidance or a gentle warning. Connecting this to our broader theme, effective communication involves choosing the right expressions of advice and knowing when to use them. Whether we're advising someone to take action or cautioning against a particular behavior, understanding these nuances helps us be clearer and more persuasive in our messaging. So keep in mind, ought to and should are your go-to for giving advice, should for warnings, and selecting the right letter or option depends on the specific context we're addressing. This understanding strengthens our ability to communicate thoughtfully and confidently. Today, I want to talk about the basic use of V, which stands for the verb form after can, could, or be able to. You'll notice that when we use these modal phrases, the verb that follows is always in the simple form. For example, in the sentence, Ali can swim well. Swim stays in its base form. It's important to remember that after be, the forms change depending on the subject and tense. So in the present, be can be am, is, or are. But no matter what, the main verb after can or be able to remains in the simple form. This is a key point because it helps us construct correct sentences when talking about ability or possibility. When you're making statements like, I am able to speak 2 languages, you're using this structure. Understanding this rule makes your English more accurate and natural when expressing what you can or cannot do. So keep in mind, after can, could, or be able to, always use the base form of the main verb. Now let's take a look at some basic verbs with modals. For example, we have can she have a cookie? Here, can is the modal verb, and notice that the main verb have stays in its simple form. This is a key point to remember. When we use modals like can or may, the verb that follows is always in the base or simple form. Another example is may I go to the washroom? Again, may is the modal and go remains in its simple form. This pattern is consistent across different modal verbs. So the main takeaway here is that after may or can, the verb doesn't change. It stays in the basic form. This is important because it helps us construct correct questions and sentences using modals. Understanding this rule will help you speak more confidently and accurately when asking for permission or making requests. Remember, the modals are like helpers. They don't change, but they shape the meaning of the sentence significantly. Let's take a closer look at the V-base form with modal verbs. When we want to make a request or ask for permission, we often use can or could followed by the base form of the verb. For example, you might say, can I borrow your pen? Or could you pass me the salt, please? Notice that after can or could, the verb is always in its simple base form. This structure keeps the sentence straightforward and polite. Remember, using can is usually more casual, while could sounds a bit more polite or formal. Mastering this pattern helps us communicate clearly and politely in everyday situations. Now let's look at the V-base form. This is the basic form of the verb, and you'll see it used after modal verbs like may, might, or could. For example, in the sentence, I may pass chemistry's exam, the main verb pass is in its base form. Similarly, in I might see you tomorrow if you're in the office, see is also in the base form. The key point here is that when we use these modal verbs, may, might, or could, the verb that follows is always in the simple base form. This is an important rule to remember because it helps us construct correct sentences when talking about possibilities in the present or future. So to sum up, after may, might, or could, the verb is always in the simple form, not conjugated in any tense. This structure keeps our expressions clear and grammatically correct when indicating uncertainty or possibility. Now let's look at the key point here. When we use phrases like must, need to, or have to, the verbs that follow are always in the simple form. For example, in the sentence, you must wear a seatbelt when you drive, the verb wear stays in its base form or the simple form. This is an important rule to remember because it helps keep the sentence correct and clear. So no matter what the subject is, whether it's I, you, he, or they, the verb after these modal-like expressions doesn't change. It's a consistent pattern that makes using these words easier and more predictable. This ties into our overall theme of understanding verb forms and how to use modals correctly in English. Answers as follows. First, I want to emphasize that providing clear and thorough responses is crucial. When we approach questions, We should aim to understand the core of what's being asked. It's important to highlight the most significant concepts, which often means focusing on the key points that drive our overall message forward. Connecting these points to the broader theme of the presentation helps reinforce our main ideas and ensures our audience stays engaged and understands the relevance. Remember, the goal is to communicate confidently and naturally, making the information accessible and memorable.